Ethan Callahan tore open the letter with hands that hadn't trembled since the war. He read it once, then again. Then he sat down hard on the edge of his bed, like someone had knocked the air clean out of his chest. The woman coming on Friday's stagecoach was not who he expected. She was not a tired farm widow. She was not a plain, practical woman who needed a roof over her head. She was something else entirely. And when the stagecoach door finally opened, and the entire town of Red Hollow went completely, utterly silent, Ethan understood with a cold certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and stay with me until the very end. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Ethan Callahan had not spoken more than 20 words to any woman in 3 years. That was not an exaggeration. That was simply the truth of his life. A life built on hard ground, cold mornings, and the kind of silence that settles into a man's bones when he has been alone long enough that loneliness stops feeling like pain and starts feeling like weather. Just something you live inside of, something you stop trying to fight. He was 36 years old, and he looked every single year of it, not in a broken way, not in a pitiful way, but in the way that a fence post looks after years of holding against wind, still standing, still solid, but worn down to something that had forgotten what it felt like to be new. His ranch spread across 400 acres of Wyoming Territory, just outside the town of Red Hollow, and by most accounts, Ethan Callahan was a successful man. He had cattle. He had horses. He had a name that people in 3 counties recognized and respected. When he walked into a room, people moved slightly, not out of fear, but out of the kind of instinctive deference that people give to men who have earned their ground. But success, Ethan had learned, was a cold thing to come home to. Every evening, he rode back from the pasture and tied his horse at the post outside the cabin, the same post his father had built 20 years before, and he walked through the same door, and he lit the same lamp, and he sat down to a meal he had cooked himself or not cooked at all, because some evenings he simply wasn't hungry enough to bother. And the silence would settle in around him like snow. He had stopped noticing it mostly. It was his neighbor Walt Briggs who first put the idea into his head. Walt was 62 years old, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a fence wire incident. He refused to stop telling people about, and he had been married to the same woman for 38 years. He talked about his wife the way other men talked about good horses, with a deep, quiet respect that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with knowing real value when you lived alongside it. They were repairing a section of fence line one October morning when Walt said, without looking up from the wire he was stringing, "You know what your problem is, Ethan?" "I don't have a problem," Ethan said. "Your problem," Walt continued as though Ethan hadn't spoken, "is that you've been running this place like it's a machine. Feed the cattle, work, the horses, mend the fence, go to sleep, wake up, do it again. You've forgotten that a place isn't a machine. A place is a home, and a home needs people in it." "I have people," Ethan said. "I've got 2 ranch hands. You know what I mean." Ethan did know. He just didn't want to say so. "I'm not built for that anymore," he said finally, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, scraped down to something that surprised even him. "After everything, after my folks, after Daniel, I'm not the same man I was." Walt was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. "Nobody's asking you to be the man you were," Walt said. "They're asking you to be the man you are now. Those are different things, Ethan. Doesn't mean the second man doesn't deserve a life." Ethan didn't answer, but he thought about it for 3 weeks straight. He placed the advertisement in November. He felt like a fool doing it. He sat at the small desk in the corner of the cabin, where he kept his ledgers and his letters, and he stared at a blank piece of paper for the better part of an hour before he wrote anything at all. He kept starting sentences and crossing them out. He wrote things like seeking companionship, and then crossed them out because they sounded weak. He wrote things like must be capable of frontier living, and then crossed that out because it sounded like a job posting for a ranch hand. Finally, he wrote the truth. Plain and simple. Rancher seeking honest wife. must be hardworking, practical, and willing to share a difficult life. I am not a man of many words, but I am a man of my word. I will not promise romance. I will promise respect, a roof, and a fair share of everything I have built. If that is enough for you, write to me." He sent it to 3 papers, 2 in Denver, 1 in New York, because Walt's cousin had told him that there were women in the eastern cities who were desperate for a way out of lives that didn't fit them, and that some of them were stronger than people gave them credit for. He expected nothing. He expected, if anything, 1 or 2 letters from women who sounded exhausted and desperate, and he would read them and feel guilty and probably not respond to any of them. Instead, he received 11 letters in 6 weeks. Most of them he could dismiss within the first paragraph. There was a woman from Denver who wrote 4 pages about her late husband's business holdings and made it abundantly clear she was looking for a man to manage her affairs. There was a woman from St. Louis who described herself as deeply romantic in nature and who used the word adventure 7 times in 1 letter, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about how long she would last in a Wyoming winter. There was a widow from Kansas with 5 children who needed rescuing more than she needed a husband, and Ethan felt genuinely sorry for her, but knew he was not the answer to her particular problem. He read through all of them in a single evening, stacking them in a pile on the desk with the efficiency of a man sorting cattle. This one, not this one, not this one either. And then he picked up the last envelope. New York postmark. The handwriting on the outside was neat without being fussy. Controlled. Like someone who had been taught proper penmanship but had developed their own particular style somewhere along the way. He opened it. And he read, "Dear Mr. Callahan, I am writing because your advertisement was the first honest thing I have read in a very long time. You did not promise happiness. You did not promise ease. You promised respect and fairness, and those 2 things are rarer than most men understand. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 27 years old. I grew up on a horse farm in upstate New York until I was 17, so I am not the delicate city woman you might be imagining. I know how to work. I know how animals think. I know what it costs to keep land running. I do not need a perfect life, Mr. Callahan. I only need a place where my work matters and where I am allowed to be myself. If you are a man who means what he writes, then I believe we might understand each other. Respectfully, Clara Whitmore." Ethan read the letter twice. Then he set it down on the desk and stared at the lamp flame for a long time. She hadn't told him she was pretty. She hadn't told him she was lonely. She hadn't performed anything for him, no softness, no desperation, no carefully constructed image of a woman shaped to fit what a man might want. She'd just told him the truth. He wrote back the next morning. They exchanged 5 letters over the following 2 months. Each one was careful, direct, and surprisingly honest. Clara told him about the horse farm, how her father had run it with the kind of stubborn pride that made a man refuse help until it was too late, and how she had learned to anticipate problems before they happened, because no one else was going to. She told him she could handle a birth in the middle of the night. She told him she understood that land didn't care about your feelings. Ethan told her about losing his parents in the same winter when the fever went through the valley and took half of Red Hollow with it. He told her about his brother Daniel, and that was the part that cost him the most, to write the part where he had to stop twice and get up and walk around the cabin before he could sit back down and finish the sentence. Daniel had been 22. He had been the kind of young man who made a room louder just by walking into it, and he was gone now, and that hole in Ethan's life had never once gotten smaller. He hadn't told anyone that in years. He wasn't entirely sure why he told Clara, except that something in her letters made it feel safe. In her reply, she didn't offer him sympathy in the way people usually did, the wincing, tilted head kind of sympathy that made Ethan want to leave rooms. She just wrote, "I understand what it means to carry someone with you after they are gone. It doesn't get lighter. You just get stronger. And sometimes I think that's the cruelest part, that we become capable of bearing things we never should have had to bear at all." Ethan read that sentence 4 times. He folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer instead of throwing it in the stove like he did with all his correspondence. By January, they had agreed. She would come in March when the worst of the winter had passed, but before the spring rush made travel impossible. He sent her money for the train and the stagecoach from Cheyenne. She sent back a brief note, "I'll be on the Friday stage. I travel light." And that was that. Ethan told himself he was prepared. He had made a practical agreement with a practical woman, and they were both adults who understood what this was. There was no reason for nervousness. There was no reason for the strange, restless energy that had him up before dawn on Thursday morning, checking things around the ranch that did not need checking. He oiled a hinge on the barn door that had been fine for months. He reorganized the kindling pile. He swept the cabin floor twice. Walt Briggs rode by mid-morning, saw him on the porch with a broom, and stopped his horse. You swept yesterday," Walt said. "I know," Ethan said. Walt looked at him for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who has known another man for 20 years and has no need to say the obvious thing out loud. He just nodded slowly and rode on. Friday morning arrived like a sentence being passed. Ethan hitched the wagon before sunup and sat in the dark cabin drinking coffee. He didn't taste watching the lamp burn down. He had read Clara's letters again the night before, all 5 of them in order, which was something he told himself he was doing to refresh his memory on practical matters, and which had nothing to do with anything else at all. He arrived in Red Hollow 2 hours before the stage was due. "I didn't mean to be that early. It just happened." He tied the horses outside Henderson's general store and sat in the wagon and watched the town wake up around him. The baker's boy crossed the street with flour on his arms. Old Mrs. Perkins opened her curtains and saw Ethan sitting in his wagon and raised an eyebrow that said everything and nothing. The blacksmith's hammer started up steady and rhythmic, the heartbeat of a working morning. Red Hollow was not a large town. News traveled the way, weather traveled fast, and without asking permission. By the time 10 o'clock came, half the town had found reasons to be within viewing distance of the stagecoach stop. People were not subtle about it. The Henderson daughters, 3 of them ranging from 16 to 24, were suddenly very interested in the fabric bolts in the window of their father's store, which had an excellent view of the street. Doc Mercer had pulled a chair onto the front porch of his office. Walt Briggs had materialized from somewhere, leaning against a post with his arms crossed and a carefully neutral expression on his face that did not fool Ethan for a single second. "Don't say a word," Ethan told him. "I haven't said anything," Walt said pleasantly. "You're thinking very loudly." Walt smiled and looked at the street. The stagecoach was 12 minutes late. Those 12 minutes were the longest of Ethan Callahan's adult life. He stood at the edge of the platform he had climbed down from the wagon because sitting still had become physically impossible, and he watched the far end of the street where the road curved around the hill, and he told himself for the 14th time that morning that this was a practical arrangement between 2 adults and there was nothing to be nervous about. He heard the coach before he saw it. The rumble of wheels, the percussion of hooves, the driver's call to the horses as they came around the bend, and the whole rig swayed into view dust, rising in a pale cloud behind it. The coach pulled up. The driver climbed down. The door opened. A man got out first, a drummer in a brown suit with a case of samples, who looked around at the assembled crowd of Red Hollow citizens with mild alarm and stepped quickly aside. Then a pause. A hand appeared in the doorway, gloved neat, and gripped the doorframe. And Clara Whitmore stepped out of the stagecoach and into the sharp March light. The entire street went quiet. Not the polite, expectant quiet of people waiting. The sudden, instinctive quiet of people who have been genuinely surprised. Ethan felt the silence before he fully processed what he was seeing. She was not what he had imagined. Not in any version of his imagining. She was wearing a traveling dress, the color of storm clouds. Practical. Yes, nothing extravagant, but she wore it with a kind of unconscious grace that had nothing to do with the dress itself and everything to do with the woman inside it. She was not trying to be elegant. She simply was. She had dark hair pinned up under a small hat, and the March wind immediately went to work pulling pieces of it loose, and she reached up calmly and tucked one strand back without breaking her step or her composure. Her face was... Ethan searched for the word and couldn't find one that didn't sound ridiculous inside his own head, so he gave up trying. She looked around the town, taking it in, measuring it the way someone looks at a new horse before deciding whether to trust it. And then her eyes found him. They were dark and direct and completely unafraid. She walked toward him with a calm, unhurried purpose, and behind him, Ethan was dimly aware of Walt Briggs making a small, quiet sound that in another context might have been a laugh. Ethan stood exactly where he was and did not move and did not speak, because every word he had prepared, and he had prepared words, he had actually rehearsed a sentence on the way into town, which he was now profoundly grateful she couldn't know, had evaporated completely. She stopped in front of him. She looked up at him. She was shorter than he was by nearly a foot, and she said, "Are you the man who promised me a new beginning?" Her voice was quiet and even and completely steady. Ethan's was not. Yes," he managed. "I'm Ethan Callahan." She looked at him for a moment. Not with the sizing up look of someone making a judgment. More like the look of someone confirming something they had already decided. "Clara Whitmore," she said, and extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and dry and real. "Welcome to Red Hollow," he said. "Thank you," she said. And then she turned and looked down the street at the assembled citizens of Red Hollow who were attempting with almost no success to appear as though they were not all staring directly at them. "Your town is watching us," she observed. "They do that," Ethan said. "Do they always watch, or is this special?" "This is special," he admitted. Something moved across her face. Not a full smile, something smaller and more private than that. Like the beginning of a thought she hadn't finished yet. "Well then," she said. "We should give them something worth watching." She picked up her own travel bag before Ethan could reach for it and turned toward the wagon. Behind him, Ethan heard Walt Briggs say very quietly to no one in particular, "Well, I'll be." The ride out to the ranch took 40 minutes. Ethan had imagined this part of the day many times over the past several weeks. In his imagination, there had been conversation, careful, exploratory, two people building the beginnings of a working partnership. He had imagined she might ask practical questions about the ranch, and he would answer them, and they would establish the parameters of their arrangement. What actually happened was silence. But not the silence Ethan was used to. His silence, the silence of his cabin and his evenings and his long rides across the pasture, had the quality of an empty room. It was the silence of absence. This silence was different. Clara sat beside him on the wagon bench with her bag at her feet and her hands in her lap, and she watched the land open up around them as they left the town behind, and the silence between them had a particular texture to it. Not uncomfortable, not expectant, just present. Like she was comfortable enough to not fill every moment with words. He hadn't expected that. He had expected she would be nervous. He was nervous, and he was not a man who got nervous. After about 10 minutes, she spoke. "You didn't expect me," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "I expected you," he said. "You expected someone else," she said. "Someone who looked differently." A brief pause. "It's all right. You can say so. I've been shocking people since I got on the train in New York. A woman traveling alone to marry a Wyoming rancher she has never met. Apparently, that is considered unusual behavior." "Is it unusual?" he said. "Behavior. For you?" She considered that. "I have been told that I have an unusual relationship with convention," she said. "By who?" "My aunt, primarily. My cousins. My aunt's business partner, who was very put out when I declined to marry his son." Ethan glanced at her. "The son had what my aunt described as excellent prospects," Clara said, and her tone was perfectly neutral in a way that made the sentence somehow devastating. "He also had a habit of telling me to speak more quietly at dinner parties. After the second time he said it, I decided that his prospects were his problem." Ethan returned his eyes to the road. "Smart," he said. "My aunt didn't think so." "Your aunt wasn't the one who had to marry him." This time the pause was a beat longer. "No," Clara said. "She was not." They arrived at the ranch as the afternoon light was beginning to pull long and gold across the land. Ethan stopped the wagon and waited. This was the moment he had braced for, the moment when she saw it. Really saw it, and the reality of what she had agreed to settled over her like a cold cloth. He had watched it happen in his imagination a dozen times, the slight contraction of expression, the polite, careful neutrality that would descend over her face while she worked out how to be gracious about something she had already decided she couldn't live with. Clara climbed down from the wagon. She stood in front of the cabin and the barn and the fencing and the wide, cold, enormous land, and she was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to Ethan. "Your fence line on the east side needs work," she said. "I saw it when we came in. You've got at least 2 posts leaning." He stared at her. "Also," she continued, "that mare in the 3rd stall, the bay, she's close. How long has she been showing?" He blinked. 3 days. Clara nodded once, the way someone nods when information confirms something they already suspected. "Tonight most likely," she said. "We should check her before dark." She picked up her bag. She walked to the cabin door, and then she stopped and looked back at him standing by the wagon with the reins still in his hands. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "are you coming?" He followed her inside. The cabin was exactly what it was, a working man's shelter, clean because Ethan kept it that way, and for no other reason. The furniture was plain and heavy and built to last. There were no curtains. There was no color anywhere except in the faded quilt on the bed that had been his mother's. Clara set her bag down and looked around. Ethan stood in the doorway and waited. "You need curtains," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to get around to it." "How long have you been meaning to get around to it?" "A beat." 8 years, he said. This time the expression on her face was unmistakable. A real smile, brief, sudden, like light coming through a break in cloud, before she controlled it back to something more neutral. "I'll make curtains," she said. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said, and the simplicity of her tone stopped him. Not performed warmth, not politeness, just a person saying a true thing. "It's going to be my home too, Mr. Callahan. I'd like it to look like one." Ethan had no answer for that. He went to see to the horses. She was right about the mare. By 9 o'clock that evening, the bay was in distress, moving restlessly in her stall. Her breathing labored, the foal positioned wrong. Ethan had dealt with difficult births before. He knew what needed doing. But the mare was frightened, and the night was cold, and the foal wasn't coming right, and for a moment, just a moment, standing in the barn, with the lamp throwing unsteady light across the stall. He felt the specific helplessness of a man watching something he cares about and not being able to fix it fast enough. Then Clara was beside him. She had heard something from the cabin, some change in the mare's sounds that she had apparently been monitoring from inside, and she had come out without a word. She went straight to the stall. "Get me the lamp closer," she said. Ethan moved it. She was already on her knees in the straw, calm and precise. Her voice low and steady, not talking to Ethan, talking to the horse. A quiet, continuous murmur of sound that the mare responded to almost immediately, the animal's frantic motion settling by degrees. "Easy, girl. Easy. I've got you. I know it hurts. I know. Easy now." Ethan crouched beside her. "Foal's positioned wrong," she said quietly. "Front legs need to come first. She's been trying to push with them folded back." She glanced at him. "Can you hold her head? Keep her steady. Talk to her." "I don't know what to say to a horse," he said. "Doesn't matter," she said. "Just keep talking. She needs to hear a calm voice." He shifted to the mare's head and put a hand on her neck and felt the animal trembling under his palm. "Easy," he said, and his voice came out rough and low. "Easy. You're all right." He was talking to the horse. He was in some confused and sideways part of himself, also not talking to the horse. Clara worked with a sureness that he had not seen in most veterinarians. Her hands steady and careful, repositioning, guiding, and the mare's breathing was still labored, but no longer panicked, and after what felt like a very long time, but was probably 20 minutes. The foal came, wet and small and folded strange, and then suddenly breathing, and then suddenly trying to stand on legs that didn't know how to work yet. Clara sat back on her heels. Her dress was ruined. She didn't appear to notice. She watched the foal figure out its legs with an expression on her face that Ethan had no name for. Something open and private and entirely unguarded, like a person who had forgotten for a moment that anyone else was in the room. "There you go," she murmured, to the foal, or to herself, or to no one. Ethan looked at her. He had been looking at her on and off all day, with the quality of a man who has opened a letter expecting to find one thing and found something else entirely. "You've done that before," he said. "Many times," she said. She stood up and brushed straw from her skirt in a businesslike way. "My father delivered foals in the middle of winter in the dark with no help and no light, and told me to watch and learn. I watched and I learned." "Your father sounds like a hard man," Ethan said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "He was," she said. "He was also a good one. Those things weren't in conflict for him." She looked at the foal, which was now standing shakily, improbably, magnificently, on all four legs. "He died when I was 22, she said without looking at Ethan. "After that I went to live with my aunt in the city, and after 4 years of my aunt's city, I answered your advertisement." A pause. "You should know," she said. And now she did look at him, and her eyes were very direct, "that I am not running away from something I couldn't handle. I handled it. I just didn't want it anymore. There's a difference." Ethan held her gaze. "I know the difference," he said. Something passed between them, a recognition of something, though Ethan couldn't have said exactly what, and then Clara turned back to the mare and the lamp, and the moment closed over, like water closing after a stone. Chang. They walked back to the cabin in the dark. The Wyoming night was immense around them, sky crammed with stars, the cold so clean it almost had a taste to it. Their breath came out in small pale clouds that dissipated before they'd taken 3 steps. At the cabin door, Clara stopped. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Ethan," he said. "You might as well." She considered this. "Ethan," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice was something he didn't examine. "Thank you for tonight, for holding her head." "You did the work," he said. "You kept her calm," she said. "That mattered." A brief pause. "You're good with animals." "They're easier than people," he said, before he could think about whether to say it. Clara looked at him for a moment. "They're honest," she said. "That's the same thing, isn't it?" She went inside. Ethan stood outside the closed door for a moment, looking up at the enormous sky with the feeling of a man who has stepped onto ice and discovered, surprising himself, that it holds. Walt Briggs was going to hear about this tomorrow. Walt Briggs was going to be insufferably satisfied. Ethan almost didn't mind. He looked at the barn where a new foal was finding its legs in the lamplight. He looked at the cabin where the woman who had written him the most honest letter he had ever received was settling into his home like she had already decided it was hers. He went inside. "I didn't sleep much that night. Not for bad reasons. Just for the particular restlessness of a man whose world has shifted slightly on its axis. Not enough to knock anything over, but enough that the familiar dark of the ceiling above him looked different than it had the night before. Like the same room after a window has been opened. He lay there and listened to the wind, and thought about a woman who could calm a frightened horse in the dark, and talk about her dead father without flinching, and call his empty cabin a home, like she meant it. He thought about the word practical. He had chosen it carefully, had used it to himself about this arrangement for months. A practical decision. A practical woman. A practical solution to a practical problem. I was starting to think that practical had been a very small word for what was actually happening. I was starting to think he might have made a larger mistake than the one he'd been afraid of. Not the mistake of choosing the wrong woman. The mistake of not being ready for the right one. In the morning, everything would begin. And Ethan Callahan, the man who had spent 3 years building walls with the careful patience of someone who believed they would stand forever, was about to discover exactly how quickly the right person can find the door. The morning after Clara Whitmore arrived. Ethan Callahan woke up before sunrise, which was nothing new, and lay in his bedroll on the floor of the main room, which was entirely new. He had given her the bedroom. It had not been a difficult decision. There was one bedroom and one bed and two people, and they had been married by the circuit judge in Red Hollow the previous afternoon in a ceremony that lasted approximately 8 minutes and involved no flowers, no music, and no guests. Except Walt Briggs, who had appointed himself witness without being asked and cried quietly into his hat brim in a way he later denied completely. They were married. That was the truth of it. And yet, lying on the floor in the dark, listening to the wind work its way around the corners of the cabin, Ethan felt less like a married man and more like a person who had opened a door expecting one room and found an entirely different house on the other side. He got up at 4:30 and started the fire and put the coffee on. By the time the water was hot, Clara was already up. She came out of the bedroom dressed and ready. Her hair pinned back, and she went straight to the fire without a word and added another log with the easy efficiency of someone who had been doing it all her life. Ethan poured her coffee. She took the cup with both hands and looked at him over the rim. "You slept on the floor," she said. "I was comfortable," he said. "You were not comfortable," she said. "I could hear you moving around from the other room." He had no answer for that. "Ethan," she said, and her voice was direct and entirely without performance. "I am not a fragile woman. I am your wife. I understand what the arrangement is and what it is not. But I will not have you sleeping on a dirt floor in your own house. This is your home." "It's your home now too," he said. "Then we can share it like two adults," she said. "The bed is large enough. I trust you are a man of your word." Ethan looked at her. She looked back steady and calm, waiting. "All right," he said. She nodded once like a matter had been settled and drank her coffee. That was how they began. The first week went by fast. The way hard work always made time move, not pleasantly fast, but efficiently fast. The hours eaten up by tasks that needed doing and didn't wait on feelings or awkwardness, or the complicated unspoken negotiation of two strangers learning to share a space. Ethan had expected to be the one who set the pace of things. He was wrong about that too. Clara moved through the ranch with a quiet purposefulness that surprised everyone who encountered it. She did not ask permission before she started things. She did not announce what she was going to do and wait for approval. She simply saw what needed doing and did it the way someone does when they have spent years in a place where no one was going to do it for them. The curtains went up on the third day. Simple blue cotton from Henderson's store, and Ethan came in from the east pasture at noon and stopped inside the door and stood there looking at them for a long moment. They were just curtains. They were the most ordinary thing in the world. He couldn't explain why they hit him the way they did. "You don't like them," Clara said from across the room watching him. "I like them," he said. "You're staring at them like they offended you." "I'm staring at them because the windows haven't had curtains in 8 years," he said. "It's a lot to take in." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. On the fourth day, she reorganized the barn. She didn't say anything to Ethan about it. She just did it. Moved the feed storage, rearranged the stall assignments, so the animals that needed more watching were closer to the door. Created a small designated area near the entrance where foaling supplies were organized and accessible instead of scattered across 3 different shelves. Ethan's ranch hand, a taciturn man named George, who had worked the place for 6 years and communicated primarily in nods and short grunts, came to find Ethan in the afternoon and stood in front of him for a moment. "Your wife reorganized the barn," George said. "I see that," Ethan said. "It's better," George said. He nodded and walked away. That was the longest opinion George had ever offered on anything. The town was a different matter. Red Hollow had made up its collective mind about Clara Whitmore Callahan within approximately 36 hours of her arrival, and the mind it made up was divided along lines that Ethan found both predictable and irritating. The women fell into 2 camps. There were those who had decided to like her immediately, led with characteristic energy by May Henderson, the middle of the 3. Henderson daughters, who had apparently determined within 5 minutes of meeting Clara that she was the most interesting person to arrive in Red Hollow in years. May had knocked on the cabin door the 3rd morning to return a pie dish her mother had sent over with food, and had stayed for 2 hours and left talking faster than she arrived. Then there were the others. Ethan heard about them from Walt, who heard everything in Red Hollow because he was the kind of man that people talked around without noticing they were doing it. "Nora Hatch is telling people she's not what you needed," Walt said the following week, leaning against the fence post while Ethan worked the wire. "Nora Hatch has an opinion on everything," Ethan said. "She's saying a woman like that won't last the first winter. Says she's too fine for frontier living. Says you got taken in by a pretty face." Ethan kept his hands moving on the wire. "What do you think?" Walt said. "I think Nora Hatch didn't see her put a mal-presented foal in the world on her first night here," Ethan said. Walt smiled slowly. "No, she didn't. And I think anyone who uses the phrase pretty face to explain why a person does things has never paid attention to a person's face in their life," Ethan said. Walt looked at him with an expression that Ethan did not examine too closely. "Well," Walt said. "All right then." The first real test came on the 10th day. Ethan had ridden out to check the northern herd before dawn and left Clara at the ranch, which he had stopped feeling guilty about after day 3, because it had become evident that she was not someone who needed to be managed or worried over. He was wrong to stop worrying. Not about her. About other things. He came back at midday to find 3 horses in his yard that didn't belong to him, and raised voices coming from inside the cabin. He dismounted fast. The door opened before he reached it, and Clara came out, not in retreat, but in the deliberate way of someone who has decided the conversation is over and has chosen to end it on their terms. Behind her came Frank Delacroix. Frank Delacroix was not a man Ethan liked. He ran a competing spread 12 miles north, and he operated by a philosophy of acquisition, acquiring land, acquiring cattle, acquiring influence that had made him wealthy, and had made him, in Ethan's estimation, a man who mistook the price of things for their value. He also had the particular habit, common to men, who were accustomed to getting what they wanted of addressing women as though they were decorative elements of a conversation rather than participants in it. Callahan, Delacroix said, and he was smiling, which was its own kind of warning. "Didn't expect you back so soon." "It's my ranch," Ethan said. "Came to discuss that water rights agreement from last season. Your wife was just telling me." "I was telling him," Clara said from beside Ethan, her voice entirely calm, "that any agreement regarding water rights on this property would be made by you, and that I was not in a position to authorize anything on your behalf." A beat. "Which is what I told him," she added. "Twice." Delacroix's smile stayed fixed. "Pretty woman like that shouldn't have to trouble herself with business matters," he said. Ethan felt Clara go very still beside him. It was not the stillness of someone trying to control anger. It was the stillness of someone who had moved past anger into something colder and more considered. "Mr. Delacroix," she said, and her voice had a quality to it that made Ethan grateful he was not on the receiving end of it. "If you speak to me like a piece of furniture one more time, I will explain to my husband in detail, and with complete accuracy, exactly what you said when he wasn't here. And I have a very good memory." Delacroix looked at her. He looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. He was standing close enough to Clara that their shoulders were nearly touching, and he made no movement to create distance, and Delacroix was a man who understood territorial mathematics. "I'll come back when it's a better time," Delacroix said. He got on his horse. He left. Ethan watched him go. Then he turned to Clara. "He said something he shouldn't have," Ethan said. "It was not a question. He said several things he shouldn't have," Clara said, while also suggesting that the water rights agreement could be renegotiated in a direction more favorable to him and offering to make it worth your while in a way that he seemed to believe was subtle. "It was not subtle," Ethan said. "Not remotely," Clara agreed. A moment passed. "Are you all right?" Ethan said. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted just slightly. Just for a second, like a door opening on a room she usually kept closed. "I've dealt with men like that my entire adult life," she said. "They think if they smile while they're doing it, it doesn't count as what it is." "What is it?" "Disrespect," she said plainly, "dressed up as charm." "He won't come back," Ethan said. "He might," she said. "Men like that don't stop because they're stopped once. They stop when they decide the effort isn't worth it. She paused. But thank you for standing there. I didn't do anything, he said. You stood there, she said. That was enough. She went back inside. Ethan stood in the yard for a moment, staring at the road where Delacroix's dust was still settling with the particular feeling of a man who has just been shown something about a person that he will not be able to unsee. The weeks that followed built something between them that had no clean name. It was not romance, not yet, or not obviously. It was more like the feeling of a structure going up foundation work. Mostly the kind that happens underground and isn't visible, but determines everything that comes after. They developed a rhythm. Ethan woke first and started the fire and coffee. Clara took the morning barn check while he ate. They ate together, not always in conversation, but the silence between them had changed from the careful silence of two strangers to the easier silence of two people who had stopped needing to fill every moment with proof that they were comfortable. She asked him questions he didn't expect, not about the ranch operations. She had understood those within the first 10 days. She asked him about his horses, which ones he'd named, and why, what he remembered about where each one came from. She asked him what his parents had been like, and then she listened to his answers with the specific attention of someone who was genuinely interested and not simply being polite. No one had listened to him talk about his parents in years. He found himself saying things he hadn't said to anyone. My mother used to sing while she cooked, he told her one evening, and was surprised to hear his own voice saying it. Not well, she'd be the first to say so, but she sang anyway every morning. Didn't matter what kind of morning it was. Clara was quiet for a moment. What did she sing? She asked. Church songs mostly, and one Irish song her own mother had taught her. I don't remember the words anymore. He stopped. I can still hear the tune, though. That's the part that stays. Clara looked at the fire. My father used to whistle, she said quietly. Not songs, just sounds he made up. He didn't know he was doing it, I think. He'd whistle while he worked and go quiet when he stopped, and you could always tell where he was on the farm by the sound. A pause. When he died, she said, the farm went quiet in a way I had not expected. Not just the absence of a person, the absence of a sound. Ethan understood that. He understood it in his bones. Yes, he said. And that single word, that simple yes, contained more of his actual experience than he had given anyone in 3 years. Clara looked at him, and her eyes were dark and steady, and entirely without pity. You carry it well, she said. Some days, he said. That's all any of us manage, she said. Some days. 3 weeks in May, Henderson cornered Ethan outside the general store and asked him directly what he would not have answered from anyone else. Is she happy? May said. Clara, is she settling in all right? Because she seems all right, but I can't always tell with her. She's very composed. She's composed because she is, Ethan said. Not because she's hiding something. But is she happy? Ethan thought about it honestly, which was more than he would have done a month ago. I think she's finding her footing, he said. I think she's exactly who she said she was, and that's still a process when the place is new. He paused. She saved a foal the first night she was here and reorganized my barn by day 4. I think she's all right. May looked at him for a moment with the sharp, perceptive eyes of a young woman who noticed more than people gave her credit for. You like her, May said. She's my wife, he said. That's not what I said. May, he said firmly. May smiled, brilliant, unrepentant, and went back inside the store. Ethan walked to his horse. He didn't answer the question. He hadn't answered it for himself either, and he wasn't prepared to do it in the middle of the street. But the truth of it was sitting in his chest like a coal that had been burning quietly for 3 weeks, and he was starting to have to consciously avoid prodding it. The twist came on a Thursday evening 26 days after Clara arrived. Ethan came in from a long day riding the boundary fence to find a letter on the table. Not an ordinary letter. A thick envelope stamped with a law firm's seal from New York addressed to Clara in handwriting that had the aggressive confidence of a man not accustomed to being ignored. Clara was at the table. She had clearly read it. She had set it down in front of her and was sitting with her hands flat on either side of it, very still in the way she went still when something was working in her. Ethan stopped. "What is it?" he said. She looked up. "My aunt," she said. "And her attorney." He came to the table and sat across from her. "They want me to come home," she said. "They are framing it as concern for my welfare. The language is—" She paused, and something moved across her face that was close to contempt. "Careful. They are suggesting that this marriage may not be legally valid given the circumstances. They are suggesting that if I return to New York within 30 days, certain complications could be avoided." "Certain complications," Ethan repeated. "I believe what they mean," Clara said with precise coldness, "is that my aunt has told Charles Merritt, the man she wanted me to marry, that I was temporarily indisposed, and that she would like me back before he stops waiting." Ethan looked at the letter. He looked at Clara. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him as though the question surprised her. Not the words of it, but the fact of it. The fact that he had asked what she wanted, rather than telling her what she was going to do. "I'm not going back," she said. "Then you're not going back," he said. "It may not be simple," she said. "If they pursue the legal question of the marriage, then we'll answer it," he said. "We were married by a judge. There's nothing to question." He paused. "Unless you want there to be." "I don't," she said immediately, and the immediacy of it, the lack of hesitation, did something to the burning coal in Ethan's chest that he absolutely refused to examine in the middle of this conversation. "Then write them back and tell them so," he said. "Or don't write back at all. Your choice." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You're not worried about the trouble," she said. "I've had trouble before," he said. "It wasn't sent by lawyers." A pause. "My aunt can be persistent," Clara said. "So can I," Ethan said. Clara looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she folded the letter, replaced it in its envelope, and set it aside. "I'll write to them tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I was thinking I would check the north pasture fence you said was giving trouble." "It can wait until morning," he said. "I know it can wait," she said. "I'd like to go now." He understood. She needed to move. To do something physical and real, because she was a person who processed the things that hurt her through the work of her hands. He understood that, because he was exactly the same. "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. She held his gaze for one long, quiet moment. Then she picked up her coat. They walked the north fence line in the dark side by side with a lantern between them. The night was cold and enormous and silent except for the sound of their boots and the wind. They didn't talk much. But somewhere around the second post that needed resetting, Clara said without looking at him, "I was 17 the last time someone told me I didn't have to do something alone." Ethan reset the post and packed the dirt around its base. "Who was it?" he asked. "My father," she said. He straightened. She was looking at the dark space beyond the fence line, the vast flat dark of the Wyoming night. "He died 5 years ago," she said. "And after that I became very practiced at being alone." A pause. "I was good at it. I am good at it. But there is a difference between being good at something and wanting it." Ethan held the lantern and looked at her profile in the pale light. He thought about every wall he had built in the last 3 years. Every deliberate step back from warmth. Every morning he had risen into silence and told himself it was enough. "Yes," he said, "there is." She turned and looked at him. In the lantern light her face was open in a way he had not seen it before. Not the composed, careful face she showed the world, but something beneath it. Something real, and a little tired, and entirely unexpectedly vulnerable. "Ethan," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "I think," she started, and then stopped. The wind moved between them. "I think I made the right choice," she said. "Coming here." It was a small sentence. Plain and direct the way everything she said was plain and direct. It landed in his chest like something breaking open. "I'm glad you did," he said, and he meant it with every quiet, stubborn, cautious piece of himself. They finished the fence line. They walked home in the dark, and somewhere between the north pasture and the cabin door, without either of them saying another word about it, something that had been building for 26 days settled into place like a stone finding its ground. Not finished, not named, not safe yet, but real. And for Ethan Callahan, who had stopped believing in real a long time ago, real was more than he had thought he would ever have again. The letter from New York sat on the corner of the desk for 3 days before Clara wrote back. Ethan noticed, but didn't mention it. He had learned in the weeks since she arrived that Clara processed things the way the land processed rain, quietly internally, until she was ready to show what she had decided to do with it. Pushing her never worked. Waiting did. On the third evening, he came in from the barn to find her at the desk with a pen in her hand and 2 crumpled attempts in the kindling box beside her. She was staring at the blank paper in front of her with the expression of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted to say and was choosing very carefully how to say it so it could never be misread. He poured himself coffee and sat in the chair by the fire and did not look at her. 15 minutes later, he heard the scratch of pen on paper. She wrote for a long time. When she finished, she folded the letter, addressed the envelope, and set it on the edge of the desk. "Done," she said. "What did you say?" he asked. She looked at the fire. "I told them that I am a married woman living on my husband's ranch in Wyoming Territory, that I am here by my own choice and my own will, and that any further correspondence from their office regarding the matter of Charles Merritt would be treated as harassment and responded to accordingly." A brief pause. "I also told my aunt that I hope she is well, and that I bear her no ill will, because that part is actually true, and I see no reason to lie about it." Ethan drank his coffee. "She raised me for 4 years, Clara said, quieter now. "She fed me and clothed me and gave me a roof when I had none. I don't forget that. But she also spent 4 years trying to reshape me into something I was not, and I don't forget that either." She looked at her hands. "You can love someone and still need to leave them. Those 2 things don't cancel each other out." "No," Ethan said. "They don't." She looked at him. "Did you ever love someone you had to leave?" she asked. The question landed in the particular quiet of the cabin at night, the kind of quiet that made honesty easier, or at least made the cost of dishonesty feel higher. "My brother Daniel," he said. "Not leaving exactly. More like being the one who stayed. After he died, I had to figure out how to be here without him. That felt like leaving him every single morning." Clara was very still. "How was the kind of person who made everything louder?" Ethan said. "I don't mean noisy, I mean more present. Things were more themselves when Daniel was in the room. The horses were livelier. The food tasted better. Even the arguments were better." He stopped. "I've never said that to anyone." "Why not?" she asked. "Because it sounds like foolishness," he said. "It doesn't," she said. "It sounds exactly true." He looked at her, and she was watching him with those dark, direct eyes that never flinched from whatever they found. "I think," she said carefully, "that the people who make everything louder are the hardest ones to lose, because they don't just leave a silence, they leave a different world." Ethan set down his cup. He had nothing to say to that, because there was nothing to add. She had said the exact true thing, and adding words to it would only dilute it. They sat by the fire for another hour, not talking much, and it was the best evening Ethan had spent in longer than he could honestly calculate. April arrived like a promise being kept. The land responded with the particular energy of a place that has endured a long winter and is finally permitted to be itself again. Ethan's cattle, which had been confined to the closer pastures, were moved to the eastern range. 3 new foals arrived in 2 weeks, healthy without trouble. Though Clara checked on each birth with the focused attention of someone who had seen enough difficult ones not to take easy ones for granted, she had become, in the quiet and organic way of things that happen without announcement, indispensable. Not to the ranch, to Ethan. I was aware of this, the way a person becomes aware of a change in the weather gradually, then all at once. He would catch himself in the middle of the east pasture, thinking about something she had said 3 days ago and turning it over in his mind. He would notice returning to the ranch at end of day that the last quarter mile of the ride home felt different than the first mile out, that he was moving toward something now instead of simply back. He did not say any of this. I was not yet a man who knew how to say it, but he showed it the only ways he knew. He fixed the stall door she had mentioned twice without ever asking him twice. He brought her a bolt of green fabric from Henderson's because she had looked at it for a moment too long and then walked past it with the practiced discipline of a woman who had learned not to want things. He asked her opinion on the breeding schedule, not because he needed it, but because she had opinions worth hearing and had stopped offering them without invitation. After Delacroix's visit, a restraint Ethan suspected she had developed as self-protection and had not yet unlearned. She noticed. Clara noticed everything. But she didn't make it into something it wasn't ready to be. She accepted each gesture at its face value, the way a person accepts a small gift, without making the giver feel seen before they're ready. That restraint, that particular consideration, was its own kind of intimacy. And it undid him more than anything else could have. The first crack in this careful structure they had built appeared on a Wednesday evening in mid-April, and it came from the most unexpected direction. Walt Briggs's wife, Ruth, died. She had been ill through the winter, a slow illness, the kind that gives people time to prepare, and then takes them anyway, indifferent to preparation. She went quietly in the early morning, Walt beside her, and by noon, the news had spread through Red Hollow the way all news spread there. Ethan heard it from George, who had heard it from the blacksmith, who had ridden past the Briggs place, and been told by Walt himself, standing in the door of his house with his hat in both hands, and his face doing the thing faces do when grief is so large that the features can't quite organize themselves around it. Ethan went immediately. He told Clara where he was going. She was already untying her apron. "I'm coming," she said. "You don't have to." "Walt is your oldest friend," she said. "I'm coming." They rode together. Walt's house was small and warm, and smelled of the particular combination of wood smoke and dried herbs that Ruth had cultivated over 38 years of making it a home. Walt was sitting in the kitchen when they arrived, a cup of cold coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched, staring at nothing. Ethan sat down across from him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He sat there and was present, which was the only honest thing he had to offer. Clara went to the stove. Without asking, without announcing, she rebuilt the fire-heated water, found the tea, Ruth's tea, on the shelf where it had always been, and put a cup in front of Walt that was warm and real. Walt looked at the cup. He looked at Clara. His eyes were red and dry in the way of a man who has spent all his tears on the morning and is now in the long afternoon of grief that is worse because it's quieter. "She would have liked you," he said to Clara. "She always said Ethan needed someone who didn't back down from him." Clara sat beside him. "Tell me about her," she said simply. Walt looked at her, and then, with a slowness and a grace that Ethan watched with something close to reverence, Walt Briggs started to talk about his wife. He talked for 2 hours. Clara listened to every word. Ethan watched her listen, watched her ask the exact right questions at the exact right moments, watched her laugh at the funny stories and go still at the hard ones. Watched her give Walt's grief the dignity of her complete attention, and something inside him that had been holding very carefully for a very long time began very slowly to let go. When they rode home in the late evening, Clara was quiet beside him. After a while she said, 38 years, and he still lit up when he said her name. "Yes," Ethan said. "That's something," she said. "It is," he said. Another silence. "Do you think that's rare?" she asked. "That kind of thing, after that long." He thought about it honestly. "I used to think it was," he said. "Now I think it depends on who you start with." He felt her look at him in the dark. Neither of them said anything else. But the silence on the way home was entirely different from the silence on the way there, and they both knew it, and neither of them was quite ready to name it yet. 3 days after Ruth's funeral, the weather turned. Not the gradual turn of seasons, but the sudden violent turn of Wyoming in late April. When winter, which everyone had assumed was finished, comes back one final time with everything it has left. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an afternoon. Ethan read the sky at noon and went immediately to Clara. "Storm coming," he said. "Bad one. We need to get the cattle in from the East Range before it hits, and I need you to help George close the barn and make sure the new foals are all inside." "How long do we have?" she asked. 4 hours, maybe less. She was already moving. They split the work without discussion. Ethan and his second ranch hand rode east. Clara and George took the barn. It was the natural division of a functioning partnership made without words, because words would have slowed them down, and watching her go purposeful. Quick, entirely unafraid. Ethan had the specific thought, clear and startling as a bell, that this was the most competent person he had ever shared work with. He didn't have time to stay with the thought. He was already riding. The cattle came in harder than expected. 2 steers had pushed through a weakened section of fence and gone further east than Ethan realized, and by the time he and Tom had found them and turned them and pushed them back, the sky had become the particular dark green-gray that experienced Wyoming people recognized as serious. They made it back. The cattle were in. The barn was closed. Ethan came through the door of the cabin, stamping cold from his boots, to find Clara at the fire adding the last of what was in the wood box. He registered this immediately. "How much wood is on the porch?" he asked. "I already moved it inside," she said. "All of it. George helped before he went to the bunkhouse." She looked at him. "We're covered for at least 3 days." He looked at the stack of wood along the wall. 3 days at minimum. She had thought ahead far enough for 3 days. "Good," he said. "There's stew on," she said. "Eat before it gets worse." He ate. It got worse. By 8 o'clock that night, the storm had arrived in full, and it was unlike anything Ethan had seen in several years. The wind hit the cabin in waves, each one harder than the last, and the sound of it was immense. Not howling, which was the word people used who hadn't actually heard a Wyoming blizzard, but a constant pressurized roar that made the walls of the cabin feel thin. Ethan checked the door twice to make sure the bar was set. Clara was at the table with a mending basket, working by lamplight, with the focused calm of a woman who had decided that panic was not going to be useful, and had therefore set it aside entirely. "You're not worried," he said. "I'm always worried during bad storms," she said without looking up. "I just don't find it helpful to perform it." He sat down across from her. "My father used to say that the storm doesn't care what you feel about it," she said. "So you might as well feel something useful." "Useful like what?" "Useful like paying attention," she said. "Counting what you have, thinking about what comes next." "What do we have?" he said. She looked up from her mending. "Food for 2 weeks. Wood for 3 days. 2 healthy new foals in a closed barn with a man in the bunkhouse 20 feet away who knows what to do." She held his gaze. "We have everything we need." The lamp flickered as a particularly violent gust found some gap in the cabin walls. Ethan looked at it. "Tell me something," he said. Not a question exactly, a request. Clara set down the mending. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Anything," he said. "Tell me something I don't know about you." She looked at him for a moment, as though measuring the sincerity of the request. "I can read Latin," she said. He stared at her. "My father had 3 books in Latin, and no one to read them, and I was bored one winter, and he sat down with me, and we went through them together." A small pause. "It took 2 winters, but I can read it." "What were the books about?" "One was Virgil. One was Caesar's military campaigns, which was actually useful, better tactical thinking in it than most people would credit." She looked at the lamp. "And one was a medical text that I believe had no business being in a horse farmer's house, but which taught me more practical anatomy than I would have learned otherwise." Ethan shook his head slowly. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just revising my understanding of you again." "How often do you do that?" "About every 3 days," he said honestly. Her expression shifted into that almost smile, the one that lived at the very edge of her composure and came out only when she forgot to manage it. "I keep expecting you to be surprised when I turn out to be a person," she said, "and I keep being surprised that you are." "Most men wouldn't let that bother them," he said. "You're not most men," she said simply. The storm hit the cabin like a fist. The lamp went out. Ethan was on his feet and had the lamp relit in 30 seconds. Clara hadn't moved from her chair. She'd put her hand flat on the table in the dark to keep her orientation and waited, which was somehow more impressive than if she'd jumped up to help. "I need to check the barn," he said. "In this," she said. "The foals." "George is there," she said. "George is one man and those foals are—" "Ethan." Her voice was firm. "If you go out in this right now, you are not checking on the foals. You are risking your life. Wait 20 minutes, see if it settles." He stopped. She was right. He knew she was right. He had been in storms like this before, and he knew exactly what went wrong when men made decisions from anxiety instead of sense. He sat back down. He lasted 11 minutes. At 11 minutes, something changed in the sound of the storm, a shift in pitch, a sudden swell, and Ethan's instincts, which had been built over 36 years of ranch living, and were not wrong about these things, told him that one of the animals was in trouble. He was on his feet. "I have to go," he said. "Then I'm going with you," Clara said, already standing. "No," he said. "Absolutely not." "You are not going out in a blizzard alone," she said. "I've done it before." "That is not a reassuring argument," she said sharply. "Clara, Ethan." She stepped toward him. "If something happens to you out there alone, no one will know where you are or which direction you went. That is not practical, that is not sensible, and you know it." He looked at her. She was right again. He hated that she was right again. "We rope together," he said. "We don't let go of each other." "Agreed," she said, and she was already reaching for her coat. They tied together with 20 feet of rope at the waist. Ethan went first. The moment they opened the cabin door, the storm came in like a physical thing, not just cold, not just wind, but a full sensory erasure that took sight and sound and replaced them with white and roar. Ethan pulled the door shut behind them and kept his hand on the cabin wall and moved. The barn was 60 feet from the cabin. 60 feet in that storm was a different kind of distance. He moved along the cabin wall to the corner, then put his arm out to find the fence post he had set close to the barn path for exactly this kind of emergency. A line of posts his father had installed decades ago, after a hand got lost in a whiteout and wandered for 6 hours before finding his way back. Ethan reached the first post, then the second, then the third. The rope between them went taut, then slackened. Clara was keeping up. He found the barn door. He pulled it open, and they went in, and the sudden relative warmth and quiet of the barn. The animal sounds. The smell of hay was so complete a contrast that Ethan stood for a moment, just breathing. George was there. He had a lamp and a tense expression that loosened slightly when he saw them. "Thought I heard something wrong with the bay foal," he said. "She's all right. Think it was just the storm sound. But I wasn't sure enough to ignore it." Clara was already at the stall. She checked the foal hands, quick and certain, talking in that low, steady murmur, and straightened up. "She's fine," she said. "Frightened, but fine." Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding for the last 15 minutes. "We stay until it settles," he said. "All 3 of us." They stayed in the barn for 2 hours. Clara sat in the clean straw near the bay foal's stall with the lamp beside her, and the foal's head drifted down and rested near her shoulder, and she let it, and George sat on a hay bale and fell asleep within 20 minutes, because George had the particular gift of a working man who could sleep anywhere a situation permitted. Ethan sat across from Clara. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm all right," she said. "You're going to be cold when we get back." "I'm cold now," she said. "It isn't stopping me." He leaned his head back against the stall post. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "Thank you," he said, "for coming with me." "You'd have gone without me if I hadn't," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then I didn't give you a choice." "You gave me sense," he said. "That's more valuable." She looked at him across the lamp. The foal shifted behind her and sighed the way horses sigh, enormous and slow, and in the barn with the storm going on outside. That sound was the most peaceful thing Ethan had heard in months. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Yes," he said. "Do you ever think about what you would have done," she said, "if I had been different? If the woman who stepped off that stagecoach had been what you expected?" Ethan thought about it genuinely. "I think," he said slowly, "I would have done right by her, done what I promised, given her the respect I offered." A pause. "But I don't think I would be sitting in a barn at midnight in a blizzard, having the best conversation I've had in 3 years." Clara was very still. "Is that what this is?" she asked. "The best conversation?" "The whole month is," he said, "if we're being honest." She looked down at the foal. Something moved across her face. Something that was past composure, past the careful management she used with the world. Something that was simply feeling unfiltered and real. "I told my aunt," she said quietly, "when I told her I was leaving, that I was going to marry a rancher in Wyoming who had promised me honesty and respect. She told me I was being a fool. She told me I was throwing my life away for a romantic notion." A pause. "I told her I was not being romantic. I was being realistic about what I needed." "And?" he said. "And she was right that it was a risk," Clara said. "She was wrong about everything else." Ethan held that. He held it carefully, the way you hold something that matters. "I'm glad you took the risk," he said. "So am I," she said. They looked at each other across the lamp in the hay-warm quiet of the barn while the blizzard roared overhead. And something that had been building since the first letter, since I only need a place where my work matters and where I am allowed to be myself, crested. Not with a declaration, not with a grand gesture, with Ethan Callahan, reaching across the space between them and putting his hand over Clara's where it rested on her knee, and Clara turning her hand over and holding his, and both of them sitting quietly in the lamplight, with the storm outside, and a sleeping ranch hand 10 feet away, and a full breathing warmth into the air behind them. That was all. That was everything. They made it back to the cabin when the storm began to ease around 3 in the morning. Ethan untied the rope at the cabin door. Clara went inside first. He followed. She stopped in the middle of the room and turned to face him. Her face was wind-burned, and her hair had come completely loose, and she looked, Ethan thought, more beautiful than the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 4 weeks ago. Not because anything had changed in her features, but because he was seeing all of her now, not just the surface of her. "Ethan," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not a woman who says things she doesn't mean," she said. "I want you to understand that before I say this." He waited. "I think," she said, "that somewhere in the last 4 weeks, this stopped being an arrangement for me." The cabin was very quiet. "It stopped being an arrangement for me too," he said. She looked at him, and the last of the composure that she had worn, like armor since the day she arrived, fell away completely. And what was underneath it was not weakness. It was the opposite of weakness. It was a person who had survived a great deal, and chosen with full knowledge of the cost to trust someone again. He crossed the room. He took her face in both hands, hands that had mended fence wire and guided frightened animals and been rough with work for 36 years. And he held her with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a man who understood the value of what he was holding. "Clara Whitmore Callahan," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "I am not a man of many words," he said, "but the ones I have are yours." She put her hands over his. "That's enough," she said. "That is more than enough." The storm broke by morning. Ethan and Clara stood on the porch in the first gray light and looked at the white remade world. Everything was different. The land looked the same. The cabin was the same. The barn and the fences and the horses and the cattle were all exactly where they had been the night before. But the two people standing on the porch were not the same people who had closed that door 12 hours ago. Something had been finished between them, and something had begun, and both of those things were true at once. Clara leaned slightly against his side. Ethan put his arm around her shoulders. They stood there in the cold morning light and watched the sun come up over Wyoming, and there was nothing between them anymore. No careful distance, no managed composure, no practical arrangement, maintained like a fence between two people who had forgotten they were also just two people. Just this. Just them. After a while, Clara said, "The east fence will need checking after that wind." "I know," he said. "And the hay storage roof was making a sound I didn't like before it got bad. I'll look at it today." "The foal is fine," he said. "You checked her twice." She was quiet for the moment. "I just need to make sure everything is all right," she said. And he understood that she was not talking about the fence or the roof or the foal. He tightened his arm around her. "Everything is all right," he said. She let out a long, slow breath. "Good," she said. The sun came up fully over the horizon. The work was waiting. And for the first time in longer than Ethan Callahan could honestly remember, he was glad it was. The morning after the storm, Ethan fixed the hay storage roof, while Clara checked every fence post on the south line, and George quietly repaired the section of east fence that had come down in the wind, and nobody said anything about the previous night because nobody needed to. That was the thing about what had shifted between them. It didn't require a conversation. It didn't require negotiation or naming or the careful verbal documentation that some people needed before they could trust a thing was real. It was simply present in the way Ethan handed her coffee in the morning without being asked. The cup prepared exactly how she took it, which he had learned by watching and never by asking. In the way Clara left his ledger open on the desk with a small note beside it. 3 words: East Pasture. Count on the mornings she'd ridden out before he woke and done the tally herself. In the way they moved around each other in the cabin now, without the careful wide-berth courtesy of strangers sharing a space, but with the easy, instinctive awareness of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms without trying. Walt Briggs came by on a Thursday, 3 days after the storm, ostensibly to return a tool he had borrowed 6 weeks ago, and actually to see for himself what he had been hearing from May Henderson, who had been hearing it from Clara, who was apparently unaware that May treated information the way water treated a slope. It found its way everywhere eventually. Ethan was mending tack on the porch when Walt rode up. Walt looked at him. Then he looked at the cabin where the sound of Clara and May's voices could be heard from inside. Not the words, just the particular quality of 2 women talking with the ease of people who had stopped being careful around each other. Then he looked back at Ethan. "Well," Walt said. "Don't," Ethan said. "I haven't said a word." "You're about to." Walt climbed down from his horse and sat on the porch step and was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was choosing his words with more care than usual. "Ruth used to say," Walt began, "that the measure of a good marriage wasn't how you felt on the good days. She said any 2 people can feel good about each other on a good day." He looked at his hands. "She said the measure was how you moved toward each other on the hard ones." Ethan kept his hands on the tack. "The storm was a hard day," Walt said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Ethan said. And a pause. "And we moved toward each other," Ethan said. Walt was quiet for a long moment. "Ruth would have liked her very much," he said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him something, and Ethan heard the cost and didn't look up because Walt wouldn't want him to. "You told me that once before," Ethan said quietly. "I know," Walt said. "I meant it more now." They sat on the porch in the spring morning and didn't say anything else for a while, and it was the comfortable silence of 2 men who had known each other long enough that silence had its own language. May came in warm and fast. The ranch entered its most demanding season. The breeding program, the spring cattle drive preparation, the endless maintenance of land that didn't pause for human exhaustion, and Ethan and Clara moved through it like a machine that had finally had all its parts fitted correctly. She took over the horse breeding records entirely. This had not been discussed. It had happened the way most things between them happened, organically through demonstrated competence and the natural sorting of labor between 2 people who were paying attention to what each other was good at. Clara had a memory for bloodlines and a judgment about matching that Ethan respected immediately because he had tested it twice against his own instincts and found her right both times. She also had opinions about the cattle operation that she had kept largely to herself until Ethan asked directly. He asked because George, in one of his rare extended communications, had mentioned casually that Mrs. Callahan had a thought about the east pasture rotation, and when Ethan had asked Clara about it, she'd said, "It was nothing, just an observation," with the particular carefulness of a woman who had learned that having opinions in rooms where she wasn't expected to have them created problems. "Tell me the observation," Ethan said. "It's your operation," she said. "Clara." He turned to face her. "I'm not Frank Delacroix. Tell me the observation." She looked at him steadily. Then she told him. She was right, about all of it. They rearranged the pasture rotation the following week, and the cattle showed better condition within a month, and Ethan told her so directly, and watched something relax in her expression, that he realized with a slow anger at himself had been held tense because she had been waiting for him to take credit for it, or dismiss it, or do any of the dozen things men in her life had apparently done when she turned out to know something they hadn't expected. "This is your operation too," he said. "Whatever you see, I want to hear it." "You mean that," she said. Not a question. More like a person confirming something they are still slightly surprised by. "I mean everything I say," he told her. "You should know that by now." She held his gaze for a moment. "I do know that," she said. "I'm still getting used to it." The second letter from New York arrived in late May. Ethan saw it on the table when he came in from the midday barn. Checked the same firm's seal, the same aggressive handwriting on the envelope, and felt a specific cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Clara came in behind him. She saw the letter. She picked it up without hesitation, opened it, read it in 30 seconds flat, and set it back down on the table with a controlled precision that Ethan recognized as anger being managed. "What does it say?" he asked. "Charles Merritt is coming to Wyoming," she said. The cold in Ethan's chest dropped several degrees. "He's what? Coming to Wyoming?" Her voice was even, which was its own kind of signal. Clara's voice went even the way a sky went flat before a storm. "My aunt's letter says he is traveling on business to Denver and intends to stop in the territory. She frames it as a courtesy call. She says he simply wants to assure himself of my welfare." "He's traveling 3 days out of his way to assure himself of your welfare," Ethan said flatly. "He is not a man accustomed to being told no," Clara said. "When 2 weeks." Ethan looked at the letter. He looked at Clara. "What do you want to do?" he said. She put her hands flat on the table, which was what she did when she was thinking hard about something she had already half decided. "I want to be very clear," she said. "To him and to my aunt, and to anyone else who is still operating under the impression that I am a problem to be retrieved." She looked up. "I am not going to hide. I am not going to absent myself from my own home. And I am not going to be managed." "No," Ethan agreed. "You're not." "I need to know," she said, and for just a moment, just the briefest fracture, something uncertain moved through her voice. "That you're that we are. We're solid," he said. "Whatever he comes here expecting to find, he'll find a husband who has no intention of being convenient for him." She let out a slow breath. "I've been handling men like Charles Merritt my entire adult life," she said. "I know how they think. They think that if they apply enough pressure in the right place, the thing they want will give way. They've never learned that some things don't give." "Have they never met a Wyoming fence post?" Ethan said. Something broke through her composure, a real laugh, sudden and surprised, and the sound of it in the cabin was so immediate and vivid that Ethan held it in his chest like something he wanted to keep. "I suppose they haven't," she said, and she was still almost smiling, the storm in her expression broken by it. "Then he'll learn," Ethan said. The 2 weeks before Merritt's expected arrival became unexpectedly the best 2 weeks of Ethan Callahan's adult life. He couldn't have explained that to anyone in a way that would make sense. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no declarations, no grand events, no moments that would make a good story. It was ordinary time work and meals and evenings by the fire and the slow accumulation of shared days. But something had been freed between them by the storm and by the letter, and by the way they had handled both, and the freedom of it meant they moved toward each other now, instead of carefully around each other, and the difference was enormous. They talked differently, not just longer or more often, but with less management. Clara stopped performing composure with him. She let him see the annoyance when something went wrong. The delight when one of the mares delivered a foal with better confirmation than either parent had promised, the dry and occasionally devastating humor that she deployed on the world with the precision of a woman who had learned to use wit as a survival tool and had become very good at it. One evening she read to him. She had found a copy of Virgil in a box of books that had been his mother's untouched for years, and she had brought it to the fire with the caution of someone handling something they weren't sure they had permission to touch. "These were your mother's," she said. "Most of them," he said. "She was educated, more than people expected." Clara looked at the book. "May I?" she said. "Go ahead," he said. She opened it and read, not translating stiffly, but moving through the Latin with the ease of someone who had spent 2 childhood winters inside that language, and her voice in the firelit cabin took on a quality that Ethan had no previous experience of, something ancient and unhurried, completely unlike the efficient directness of her everyday speech. He didn't understand the words. He understood everything else. When she stopped and looked up at him, her expression shifted when she saw his face. "What?" she said. "Ed." "Nothing," he said. "Keep going. You can't understand it." "I know," he said. "I don't need to." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back at the page, and she kept reading, and the fire burned down around them, and Ethan sat in his chair in his cabin in Wyoming and felt for the first time in many years that his life was something he was actually living rather than simply maintaining. Charles Merritt arrived on a Tuesday. He did not come to the ranch first. He came to Red Hollow. Ethan heard about it from May Henderson, who came to the ranch at an agitated canter that would have alarmed Ethan if he hadn't been learning to read May's particular scales of urgency. "There's a man in town," May said, breathless, at the door. "From New York. Very fine suit. Asking about Clara at the hotel." Clara was in the barn. Ethan went to get her. She heard May's account with the stillness she used when things were serious, and then she said, "What did he say about me exactly?" "He told Mr. Dobbins at the hotel that he was a family friend come to check on Mrs. Callahan's welfare," May said. "He was very polished about it. But he also asked about you, Ethan. Asked how long you'd been ranching here, what kind of man you were, whether the ranch was," he said, "prosperous." Clara's jaw tightened. Ethan watched her. "He's establishing whether I married well or whether I married desperation," she said quietly. "He's trying to decide which argument to use." "What arguments does he have?" Ethan said. "He has money," she said. "He has social position. And he has my aunt's support, which means he probably has a letter from her somewhere claiming concern for my state of mind." She looked at Ethan directly. "He is going to suggest tactfully that I was in a vulnerable position when I answered your advertisement, and that my judgment may not have been sound." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And was your judgment sound?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "It was the soundest decision I have ever made," she said. "Then that's what we tell him," Ethan said. Merritt came to the ranch the following morning. He was exactly what Ethan expected, polished in the way that money made a man, polished with clothes that cost more than most people in Red Hollow, made in 2 months, and a manner that was simultaneously gracious and subtly aggressive, like a man who had learned to negotiate by making the other person forget they were being negotiated with. He shook Ethan's hand with the firm grip of a man establishing position and said he was delighted to meet him at last. And his eyes, while he said it, were moving around the ranch with the assessment of a man pricing something. "Clara," he said, turning to her, and his voice shifted, warmer, more personal, with the practiced intimacy of someone who had rehearsed this approach. "You look well. The frontier life must suit you." "It does," Clara said, pleasantly, completely without warmth. "Your aunt is worried about you," he said. "We both are." "My aunt expresses worry by sending attorneys," Clara said. "I've never found that particularly comforting." Merritt's smile stayed. It was a very good smile, Ethan noted. Well maintained. "She cares for you," he said. "As do I. Clara, I think if you'd give me a few minutes to speak with you privately." "There's nothing you would say to me privately that you can't say in front of my husband," Clara said. A beat. Merritt adjusted. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I simply wanted to say, and I hope you'll hear this in the spirit it's intended, that the door is still open. Whatever circumstances led you here, Whatever you felt you needed at the time, that doesn't have to be permanent. Your aunt's house is still your home. My offer still stands." Silence. Clara tilted her head very slightly the way she did when she was choosing her words. "Charles," she said, and her use of his name was not warmth. It was the kind of directness that removed all social padding from what followed. "I did not come to Wyoming because I was vulnerable or confused or running from something I couldn't handle. I came because I chose to. I married Ethan because I chose to. I stay because I choose to every single morning." She held his gaze without effort. "The door you're describing is a door to a life I already examined and declined. It didn't become more appealing because you traveled a long way to offer it again." Merritt was quiet. His smile had not moved, but something behind it had. "You've changed," he said. "I haven't," she said. "You just weren't paying attention before." He turned to Ethan. This was the moment Ethan had expected the man-to-man move, the appeal to some imagined fraternal solidarity. "Callahan," Merritt said, with the easy confidence of a man who believed other men could always be reached through their self-interest. "You seem like a practical fellow. Clara's family has resources. If this arrangement isn't, if the situation has become complicated." "It hasn't," Ethan said. "I'm simply saying that if there's any way I could—" "There isn't," Ethan said. His voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised, quiet, flat, and entirely without negotiating room. "My wife told you what she chose and why," he said. "I've got nothing to add to that. She speaks for herself, and she always will." He looked at Merritt steadily. "I think you've got a long ride back to Red Hollow." Merritt held his gaze for a moment. Men like Merritt, Ethan had found, were very good at reading the room. They didn't get as far as they did by misreading when a thing was finished. He looked at Clara one more time. "If you ever change your mind," he said. "I won't," she said. He left. They watched his horse disappear down the road. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara said very quietly, "Thank you for not speaking over me." Ethan looked at her. "You didn't need me to," he said. "No," she said. "But a lot of men would have anyway." He thought about that. "The day I start speaking for you," he said, "is the day you stop needing to stay here. So I plan to keep not doing it." She turned and looked at him fully, and her expression was open. In that way it had become open since the storm, since the night in the barn, since all the accumulated weight of choosing each other day by day had worn away the last of the armor she had carried into Wyoming with her. "Ethan Callahan," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad I answered your advertisement." He felt that land in the center of his chest and stay there. "So am I," he said. "Every day." She put her hand in his. He held it. And that was the end of Charles Merritt. June arrived, and the ranch moved into the full engine of summer operations, and the days were long and exhausting and good, in the way that days are good when you go to sleep, having genuinely spent yourself on something that matters. Clara had become, without anyone making a formal announcement of it, the person in Red Hollow that people came to when they had problems involving animals. Doc Mercer started consulting her on cases he had limited experience with. 2 neighboring ranchers asked her advice on their breeding programs. A farmer whose prize mare had been declining for weeks brought her by, and Clara spent 3 hours with the animal and identified a condition that 3 other people had missed, and the mare was recovering by the end of the month. Nora Hatch, who had told people that Clara was too fine for frontier living and would be gone before winter, came into Henderson's store one afternoon while Clara was there, and stood in the doorway for a long moment. Clara looked up. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Nora Hatch crossed the store, picked up the bolt of fabric she'd come for, paid for it, and on her way out stopped beside Clara. "You handled the miller's mare," she said. "I did," Clara said. A pause. "Good work," Nora said, and walked out. May Henderson, watching from behind the counter, looked as though she might faint from the significance of it. Clara put the bolt of thread she was holding back on the shelf, picked up the color she actually wanted, and paid for it. "Don't make it into more than it is," she told May. "She has never in her life said good work to anyone," May whispered. "Then she should practice more," Clara said. It didn't seem to hurt her. It was a Sunday evening in late June when Clara told Ethan. They were on the porch he had built 3 years ago and sat on alone for 3 years, and now sat on with her in the evenings, while the sky did what Wyoming skies did in summer, which was put on a show that no reasonable person could be indifferent to. She had been quiet for most of the evening, not the productive quiet of a woman thinking something through. The different quiet of a woman who has already thought something through and is gathering the nerve to say it. He noticed. He waited. Finally she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I'm not entirely sure how you'll feel about it," she said. The particular careful quality of her voice made his attention sharpen. "Clara," he said, "tell me." She turned to look at him. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. The porch was very quiet. The sky was enormous. Somewhere down in the pasture a horse moved through grass. Ethan sat completely still. Clara was watching him with the focused, careful attention of someone who is prepared to respond to whatever comes next. And he understood in the way he was understanding more and more things about her that she had spent time preparing herself for multiple versions of this moment, because she had learned not to assume how people would take the news of something unexpected. He reached out and took her hand. His hands were shaking. He had not noticed them shaking. He noticed now. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at their joined hands. He thought about his mother who had sung every morning no matter what kind of morning it was. He thought about Daniel, who had made every room louder just by being in it. He thought about all the people he had lost and the long years he had spent being afraid that loving anything meant being certain of losing it. He thought about Clara in the barn on her first night calm and certain saving the life of a foal that had come into the world wrong. He thought about her hand in his on the north fence line in the dark. He thought about her reading Latin by the fire in the voice that had no need to be anything other than what it was. "Ethan," Clara said, and her voice had a quality he had never heard in it before, something fragile at the edges, something that was very nearly afraid, and from Clara, who feared nothing that he had seen, that vulnerability was more moving than anything else could have been. "Are you all right?" she said. He looked up at her. His eyes were burning. How was he realized? Not all right in the narrow sense of the word. He was overwhelmed. He was terrified. He was flooded with every fear that had spent years accumulating in a man who had been afraid to want things because wanting things had cost him so much. But he was all right in the only way that mattered. "Yes," he said, and his voice came out rough and honest and completely without performance. "I'm all right." He tightened his hand around hers. "I'm more than all right." Her face changed. The fragility at the edges resolved into something else, something that was relief and joy and the careful, hard-won trust of a woman who had taken a risk and found solid ground on the other side of it. "I wasn't sure how you'd feel," she said again. "I'm terrified," he said honestly. "So am I," she said. "I don't know how to be someone's father," he said. "I don't know how to be someone's mother," she said. "We'll figure it out." What if he started and he stopped because the what-ifs were enormous and he had spent years feeding them and he knew exactly where they led? Clara squeezed his hand hard. "Ethan," she said firmly. He stopped. "You spent years surviving," she said. "Every hard thing that came for you, you survived it. You're still here." Her voice was steady and clear and entirely sure of itself. "Now you have to learn how to live. Those are different things. And I am not going to let you choose surviving over living. Not anymore." He looked at her. She looked back. No flinching. No softening it into something easier to hear. Just the truth delivered by a woman who had crossed half a continent to find a place where the truth was something she was allowed to speak. He brought her hand to his mouth. He pressed his lips to her knuckles and held them there, and she felt his breath and the slight tremor in his jaw that he couldn't quite control, and she moved closer to him on the bench and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that until the sky went fully dark. A new fear had arrived in Ethan's life tonight, and alongside it, shouldering it over larger and louder and more insistent, a joy so complete and unexpected that he had no previous experience to compare it to. He was going to be a father. Clara Whitmore Callahan was going to be a mother. The ranch that had been a machine was going to be a home. And for Ethan Callahan, the man who had written a plain and honest advertisement asking for a practical woman who understood hard life. It turned out that fate had read that letter and decided with characteristic indifference to what he thought he needed to send him something else entirely. Something that required not just survival, but the willingness, the daily deliberate terrifying willingness to live. He put his arm around her. She settled into his side. The Wyoming night spread itself above them, enormous and indifferent and full of stars. And the man who had been alone for 3 years sat on the porch of his home with his wife beside him, and the knowledge of a child coming, and felt for the first time in so long that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like that the world was not something to be endured. It was something to be in, fully, completely, with everything you had. The pregnancy changed Ethan in ways he had not anticipated and could not have prepared for, even if someone had warned him, which Walt Briggs did attempt to do approximately 48 hours after finding out in the straightforward manner of a man who believed useful information should be delivered without ceremony. "It's going to scare you every single day," Walt said, sitting on the porch with his coffee. "From now until that child is born, and then for the rest of your natural life. That's just what it is." "That's not comforting," Ethan said. "It's not meant to be comforting," Walt said. "It's meant to be accurate. There's a difference." He drank his coffee. "The fear doesn't mean something's wrong, Ethan. It means something finally matters enough to be afraid of losing." Ethan sat with that for a long time after Walt rode home. He sat with it through July and into August, through the long hot days of summer work, and the evenings on the porch, and the nights when he lay awake, listening to Clara's steady breathing beside him, and ran through every possible thing that could go wrong with the calm, methodical terror of a man who had lost enough people to know that the world did not negotiate with you about it. Clara knew he was doing it. She didn't try to stop him. She was too honest for false reassurance, and too practical for sentimental speeches about how everything would be fine, because she had lived long enough to know that everything being fine was a hope, not a guarantee. What she did instead was reach for his hand in the dark. Every night without fail, at some point in the hours before dawn, whenever she felt him go tense beside her, with whatever thought had ambushed him, she would find his hand and hold it. No words. Just that. And it worked better than words would have, because it was true in a way that words about the future could not be. It was the present tense of her, solid and real and entirely there. He told her this one morning, trying to explain it, and she looked at him with those direct dark eyes and said, "I know. That's why I do it." He shook his head. "You're going to make me into someone better than I am," he said. "You already are that person," she said. "You just spent 3 years pretending you weren't." September arrived, and with it the realization slow, and then all at once that Red Hollow had made up its collective mind about Clara Callahan, in a way that was completely different from the careful divided assessment of those first days in March. It happened without announcement, the way real things always happened in small communities, not through a single event, but through the accumulation of small ones, each one adding a layer to the picture until the picture was simply clear. There was the matter of the Miller mare, which everyone knew about. There was the matter of the Henderson youngest daughter, who had been terrified of horses her entire life, and who Clara had spent 3 Sunday afternoons with patiently and without drama until the girl could stand in a stall without flinching, which May reported to the entire town with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a miracle, which Clara said was an embarrassing overstatement, which Ethan thought was exactly like her. There was the matter of the drought scare in August, when the creek running through the south end of 3 neighboring properties dropped to a level that alarmed everyone, and Clara had suggested a water management rotation between the 3 ranches that Doc Mercer later said was the most sensible thing anyone had proposed in a crisis since he'd moved to Red Hollow 12 years ago. And there was the matter of Walt Briggs. Walt had been struggling since Ruth died, not visibly, not in the dramatic way of a man who had collapsed under his grief, but in the quieter and harder way of a man who was still doing everything right and finding that nothing felt worth doing. He still rode his fence lines. He still maintained his stock. He still showed up on Ethan's porch on Thursdays with some excuse or another. But the light had gone out of him somewhere, and everyone who knew him could see it, and no one quite knew what to do about it. Clara knew what to do about it. She started sending food over every Sunday. Not as charity. Clara was too perceptive for that, and Walt was too proud for it. She framed it as surplus, as extra, as something that would go to waste otherwise, and Walt was too polite to call her out on the fiction, and too hungry for company to refuse it. Then she started sending it with Ethan, who would stay for an hour. Then she started coming herself and staying for 2. By October, Walt Briggs was coming to their table for Sunday dinner every week, and he was talking again, really talking with the particular animation of a man who has been reminded that he still has things to say, and the light, while not what it had been, had come back enough to matter. One evening, walking home from Walt's, Ethan looked at her. "How did you know what he needed?" he said. "Because I needed the same thing once," she said. "After my father died, someone had to keep making me show up to the table." She paused. "It was a neighbor woman who barely knew us. She just kept feeding me until I remembered how to be hungry again." Ethan took her hand. "You're a remarkable person," he said. "I'm a practical one," she said, which was what she always said, and which he had long since understood was her way of deflecting the fullness of a compliment while still accepting the truth of it. "Both," he said. She leaned into his side as they walked. "Yes," she said quietly. "All right. Both." The baby came on a Thursday night in November. The timing was not convenient, which Ethan later reflected was probably appropriate. Nothing about any of it had been convenient, and it seemed fitting that this final act follow the same rule. Doc Mercer arrived in time. May Henderson arrived 17 minutes after that, uninvited and completely necessary, because it turned out that May Henderson, under pressure, was the most competent person in any room she entered, which had been hidden by her ordinary cheerfulness, the way a river's depth is hidden by its surface. Ethan was not permitted inside. This was not a negotiation. Doc Mercer told him to wait outside, and used a tone that left no room for argument, and May seconded it with a look, and Clara, in the last moment before it became serious, reached out and gripped his hand and said, "Go wait, I'll be all right." "How do you know?" he said, and his voice came out rawer than he intended. She looked at him. "Because I have survived everything else," she said. "And because I have not come this far to leave you now." I went outside. He stood on the porch in the November cold, and he waited. The sounds from inside this cabin were sounds he could not categorize with any part of his brain that was working rationally, because his brain had stopped working rationally approximately 20 minutes into the labor and had not recovered. He paced the length of the porch. He stopped pacing and stood still. He sat on the step and got up again. Walt arrived at some point. Ethan didn't know how, didn't know who had sent word, but Walt was suddenly there, sitting on the porch step with his hat in his hands, and his presence was the most stabilizing thing Ethan could have been given, because Walt had been here before, had stood outside a door, before had survived the waiting before, and his simple presence said, "This is survivable." "Talk to me," Ethan said. "About anything, something that has nothing to do with what's happening in there." Walt thought for a moment. "The spring I was 24, Walt said, "I lost every head of cattle I owned in a single flood, every single one, built back from nothing." "You've told me that story," Ethan said. "I know," Walt said. "But you weren't listening to the story. You were listening to the voice." Ethan looked at him. Walt was right. "Keep going," Ethan said. Walt kept talking. Ethan listened to the sound of his voice, not the words, the way you listen to something familiar in the dark. Not for information, but for the reassurance of presence. And then a sound came from inside the cabin. A small sound. New. Entirely distinct from everything that had come before it. A cry. Ethan stopped breathing. The door opened. May Henderson appeared, and her face was the brightest thing he had ever seen on a person. "Come in," she said. "Come in right now." He didn't remember crossing the porch, or opening the door, or walking to the bed. He remembered arriving. Clara was there, exhausted in a way he had no words for, her hair, loose and damp, her face stripped down to something essential and fierce and entirely herself. And in her arms was a child. His child. Their daughter, small and red-faced and furious at the indignity of existence, expressing that fury at considerable volume, which was the most beautiful sound Ethan Callahan had ever heard in his life, because it meant she was breathing, she was here, she was real. He sat on the edge of the bed. He could not speak. Clara looked up at him, and her eyes were wet, not with grief, with something that was the opposite of grief, something that had no name adequate to contain it, and she said, "She has your jaw." He looked at the baby. He looked at Clara. "She has your everything else," he managed. Clara laughed, rough and exhausted, and completely genuine. "Hold her," she said. "I don't know how." "Ethan." The word was gentle and certain. "Hold your daughter." Clara transferred the child into his arms with the careful precision of a woman who trusted him completely, and he held his daughter for the first time, and she was the size of almost nothing and the weight of everything, and she looked up at him, unfocused, unknowing, entirely new, and Ethan Callahan, who had spent 3 years building walls and maintaining distance and surviving. Instead of living, felt every single one of those walls come down at once. He was not ashamed of the tears. He had nothing left to be ashamed of. "Hello," he said to his daughter in a voice so low only she could hear it. "I've been afraid of you for 9 months." A pause. "I think you're going to be worth every second of it." From somewhere behind him, he heard Walt Briggs clear his throat in the way a man clears his throat when he is working very hard not to cry in public. From the doorway, May Henderson was not working hard at all. They named her Ruth. Clara suggested it on the second day quietly without preamble, while Ethan was sitting with the baby in the chair by the fire. "Ruth," she said, "if you'd like." He looked up. "For Walt's wife," he said. "For Walt's wife," she said. "And because Ruth means something worth keeping." She met his eyes. "Both things are true." Ethan looked at his daughter. "Ruth Callahan," he said. The baby, who had no opinion on the matter, but who had demonstrated over 48 hours that she was going to be vocal about everything, eventually made a small sound. "She approves," Clara said. "She's 2 days old," Ethan said. "She has opinions," Clara said. "She gets that from somewhere." He looked at her, and she was watching him with that particular expression, the one that had started as composure and become over 8 months of living alongside him. Something else entirely. Something warmer and more open and entirely unguarded. He had done that. She had let him. They had done it together. When Walt heard the name, he sat down in the kitchen chair and didn't speak for a full minute. Clara put coffee in front of him and didn't say anything either, because she understood, as she understood most things, exactly what silence needed and what it didn't. Finally, Walt said to the coffee cup, "She'd have liked that very much." "I know," Clara said. He looked up. His eyes were red, and he didn't try to hide it, and Clara didn't pretend she didn't see it. "She would have loved you," he said. "Ruth, my Ruth. She would have just loved you completely." "I wish I'd known her," Clara said. "You would have gotten along terrifyingly well," Walt said, and a laugh broke through the grief, sudden and real. "She had opinions about everything too." Clara smiled. "Then she sounds like someone I would have admired," she said. Walt looked at the baby in the cradle across the room, the cradle that Ethan had built in October, working on it in the evenings after Clara was asleep, which Clara had pretended not to know about, and which Walt had helped him finish in secret, and which had appeared one morning as though it had always been there. "She's going to be something," Walt said. "She already is," Ethan said from the doorway. The years that followed were not easy. No honest account of ranch life in Wyoming Territory would pretend otherwise. There were hard winters and difficult seasons, and cattle losses, and fence lines that seemed to fail at the worst possible moments, and the work was constant, and the land was unforgiving, and none of that changed because two people had found each other and built something real. But the hard things had a different quality now. They had weight, but they didn't have the particular crushing weight of things carried alone. They had edges, but those edges didn't cut the same way when there was someone alongside you who understood the shape of what you were carrying. Clara expanded the horse breeding operation in the second year, And in the third year, it was generating more consistent income than the cattle. And in the fourth year, 2 ranches in Colorado were purchasing their horses specifically and paying premium prices because Clara Callahan's bloodline judgment had become something people in the territory talked about. Ethan rebuilt the eastern fence line properly with new posts and new wire, and he was not doing it alone. He had hired 2 additional hands, and on weekends, George was teaching young Ruth at age 3 and then 4 the names of every horse on the property, which she learned with a terrifying speed that made Ethan suspect she had inherited her mother's memory. May Henderson married a schoolteacher from Cheyenne in the 3rd year and moved to the north end of town, and she and Clara remained the kind of friends that women become when they have seen each other in moments of genuine need. Not the polite friendship of proximity, but the real kind that endures distance and time. Walt came to Sunday dinner every week without exception. He had found in the particular way that grief sometimes unfolds when the conditions are right, that losing Ruth had not been the end of his story. It had been a chapter, the hardest chapter, the one that changed the shape of everything that followed, but not the last page. He sat at Ethan and Clara's table with Ruth on his knee and told her stories about a woman who had loved him for 38 years. And the little girl listened with the focused attention of a child who understands without being told that she is being given something precious. One evening in the 5th year, Ethan and Clara sat on the porch after Ruth had gone to sleep, the way they sat on the porch most evenings when the work was done, and the child was down, and the world had narrowed to just this. The 2 of them, the stars, the ordinary, extraordinary fact of their life. Clara said without looking at him, "My aunt wrote." He looked at her. "A real letter this time," she said. "Not attorneys, not Merritt, just her." A pause. "She's not well. She wanted me to know." "What do you want to do?" he said. She was quiet for a long time. "She was wrong about a great many things," Clara said finally. "She was wrong about what I needed, and wrong about who I was, and wrong about what a life could look like." Another pause. "But she fed me when I had nothing. And she is the last person alive who knew my father." Ethan waited. "I'd like to write back," she said. "I'd like to not forgive exactly. I don't think what she did requires forgiveness as much as it requires understanding. But I'd like to not leave it as it is." He reached for her hand. "Then write back," he said. She turned to look at him. "You don't mind." "Clara," he said, and his voice had the quiet certainty that had become over 5 years its most natural register when he was talking to her, the voice of a man who had stopped performing steadiness and simply become it. "You are the most capable person I have ever known. Whatever you decide about your aunt, whatever you decide about anything, I trust your judgment completely. I always have." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know," she said quietly, "that first letter I wrote you, the advertisement reply, I wrote it 3 times before I sent it." He raised an eyebrow. "You never told me that." "The first version was too careful," she said. "The second was too much. The third," she paused. "The third I sent because it was the truest one. But I sat with it in my hand for an hour before I put it in the envelope." "What were you afraid of?" he said. She considered. "That you would be exactly what you promised," she said. "And that I would want it so much that losing it would be worse than never having tried." The night was enormous around them, the way Wyoming nights were enormous, not threatening, just vast, the kind of vastness that puts things in proportion. "And," he said. She looked at him. The man who had stood at a dusty train platform with a prepared sentence that evaporated the moment he saw her, who had sat on a barn floor in a blizzard, holding her hand without being asked, who had built a cradle in secret, and wept without shame at the birth of his daughter, and learned slowly and imperfectly and entirely genuinely to choose living over surviving every single day. "And I was right to be afraid," she said. "Wanting something real is always frightening." She tightened her hand around his. "And worth every second of the fear." He brought her hand to his mouth. Above them, the stars did what Wyoming stars did, shone with the indifferent magnificence of things that have been burning for a long time and intend to keep burning. Inside the cabin, Ruth Callahan slept in the cradle her father had built in the home her mother had made on the ranch that had been rebuilt by two people who had found each other through an honest letter and a leap of faith, and the stubborn daily decision to choose each other when it would have been easier to choose nothing. The cowboy who had prepared for a simple bride had received something he had not prepared for and could not have imagined and would not have traded for anything the world contained. Not a transaction, not an arrangement, not a practical solution to a practical problem. A partner, a family, a home built not from wood or money or land, but from the only material that ever made a home worth living, in the unshakable, impractical, magnificent